So thank you so much, Tagan. I will stop sharing, and we're excited to learn more about your current and past work.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'm glad to see all your faces for a second. So I'm just going to take a sec to look at your pictures before I jump into this presentation. But I'm going to share a lot of information, but feel free to raise your hand, and maybe Jennifer or Jorge, if you can see people raise their hand with questions in the middle, I won't be able to see them. So like jump in, and I'll try to leave a good chunk of time at the end for questions as well. So I'm going to try to share my screen. One sec. And all right, can you all see this?
Yep.
Okay. This is something that I had to do for a job where I had to make a life map in pictures. So I just thought I would share this to give you a little visual understanding about some of the work I do after hearing all those words, which I think are a lot to take in. So I am a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and my grandparents were part of an uprising and one of the only successful escapes from a Nazi death camp. And I grew up with them, and hearing their story and hearing them testify, and their storytelling and their commitment to justice work informed a lot of my experience. And then growing up in New Haven in a very racially and economically diverse environment really helped me see the connections between the story of my ancestors and the story of many of the other peoples who I was growing up around. And so that along with my love of food and cooking has sort of led me on this lifelong journey. And I feel very grateful that I get to do work that is heart connected and work that I'm passionate about. So I'm happy to share some of that with you all today, and look forward to hearing your questions and your thoughts and reactions. Hold on, let's see if I can advance. So there's a million different diagrams explaining the food system, and most of them tend to leave the people out of the equation, so which is a really big problem. So I chose this. I did not create this, and I don't actually know who it's credited to, but I found it online and thought this was a good, very general overview of the food system. I think often when we think of the food system, we think about farms and maybe grocery stores and things, but we tend to forget about maybe a lot of the details of other parts of kind of how food moves around in our world, how it comes to be, who grows it, who moves it, how we deal with the waste. So this diagram sort of touches on the big systems like the economic system, political system, social and cultural systems and realities, environmental realities, together with sort of what humans do with food, which is the kind of growing, distributing, eating, dealing with the waste, processing, and all of those things. So I just wanted to give that overview before we jump in. So when I'm teaching about food systems, I really do this from a place of what are the values that drive this work. And so these are some of the values that I teach about. Food sovereignty as a basic human right. So we often say food is a basic human right, but food sovereignty goes beyond just having access and just having enough food to nourish ourselves, into also thinking about people having agency in food in their lives, so that they have the food that they want. They have food that is culturally connected, if that is what they want. And they have the ability to get food without too much effort, and all the sort of other elements that go into having freedom and agency within their relationship to food. Food and the food system needs to nourish humans. It needs to nourish our bodies. It needs to nourish all the animals involved in the food system, as well as the planet. So we have a food system right now that is a system in conventional agriculture that is taking a lot out of the earth without putting it back in. And that is a large contributor to the climate crisis. And so thinking about food system as something that needs to be reciprocal, that what we take out, we need to put back in, and that we need to be having food that nourishes people and treat animals in a way that is also nourishing for animals. Addressing root causes and systemic change in what we do while also meeting urgent needs. So a good example of this is that people often think about hunger or food insecurity. And of course, that is extremely urgent that we address hunger and food insecurity for people. No one on this planet should be going hungry, given how much food there is on this planet. But if we're only addressing getting food and food aid and food assistance to people, we are never actually addressing the root causes and making systemic change, such as how do we end poverty? How do we end food apartheid and people's lack of access to food, and geographic and financial difficulties? So holding both, that we need to look at the root causes, how do we make systemic change while still meeting urgent needs that are very real? And then shifting power and resources to really address centuries of intentional inequities. So if we look at divides between the global South and the global North, if we look at realities in redlined neighborhoods, which were financially and economically harmful for Black and Brown people in the United States, and really looking at systems of power and how do we shift power and how do we shift resources to really intentionally address racial and economic and geographic and other inequities. And then a very important piece is that the people in the communities that are most harmed by the food system and by these inequities need to be centered in both defining what the issues are and leading the solutions. So we have a lot of top-down problem solving that happens in this country, whether that comes from governments or whether it comes from nonprofits or businesses. And very often there's a big gap between the realities that are happening on the ground for communities that are being served by those programs, and that there's a lack of actually talking to people to say, what's really going on? What would you say the problem is? What kind of help would you like? And then actually empowering people in those communities to actually be part of leading that change. So I talked about some of this as I was explaining those values, but I wanted to bring this a little bit more into practices when we think about values for doing food justice work. And this could be in agriculture, forestry, aquaculture, as well as in many other areas. The practices, thinking about how do our practices actually help us implement our values. So one thing is that a lot of these are like super big questions that we don't have answers to. So part of this is thinking about what are the questions that we need to be asking, such as how are we addressing the root causes of this problem is a question. What are ways that we can make systemic change? How do we engage the people who are actually being harmed by this system? Those kinds of things. So constantly asking questions to see if the way that you're working and what the work is aligned with the values that you have. Then relationship building, which is so important. So whatever, it's relationship building with everyone, both the people who hold more power, people who hold less power, people directly impacted, people owning businesses, et cetera. Relationship building is really key to getting any work done effectively. So having meetings with people just to say, what do you think about this issue? If it's around, urban forestry, for example, going and talking to the parks department, talking to the people who are using the park, talking to the people who are caring for the park, talking to the people who live around the park and maybe don't use the park, going and talking to people and listening and building relationship with them is an enormous part of having success in doing any of this work. And then really thinking about where are there opportunities to have community-directed and worker-directed approaches to doing work. So if it's working with farm workers, for example, really going and listening to them and looking at what are ways that farm workers can organize together to actually make change through grassroots organizing, but also in terms of like implementing practices on a farm. So trying to avoid top-down approaches and really looking at community and worker-led approaches. what I said in the beginning, remembering to include humans in when we think about environmental sustainability. Very often we talk about whether it's a food system, whether it's environmental sustainability. We almost always, in general, our society tends to leave out the people, the workers, farmers, food service workers, everyone, all the humans involved in the system, and humans are really integral to these systems. So always bringing the humans in and their rights as human beings, whatever environment they're in, into that sustainability framework is really, really important. The other thing is really thinking about how do we give the natural world rights? So in the United States, humans have certain rights. They're not always respected, but they legally have them. And corporations are actually given rights of personhood, which allow them to have power within our court system. And given that our court system is the way that a lot of decisions and protections are created, there are people in this country and around the globe who have really worked on giving nature legal rights. So the Ojibwe people have actually won the right to have wild rice, have legal rights, and that enables them to then create protections get legal protections for that rice and prevent it from being destroyed by through conventional agriculture, through development and other things. So thinking about whether it's in a court system or other places, having the natural world having rights, and thinking about how to center that in our work. And then, really importantly, using your position and power to move these practices forward. So each of us hold identities that are, some identities we hold may give us power in our society, and some may be less part of dominant society and be places where society doesn't give us power. However, each of us has power in different ways, and learning about what power do you hold, whether it is through a position, whether it's through your relationships in your community, whether it's through a skill set that you have, whether it's through education that you have, what positions of power do you hold? And how can you use that position and work with other people to build power to bring about change, positive change? I'm happy to talk with you all more about that. That's a lot of work that I teach about, but this is just an overview. So I wanted to give some examples of food justice work. These are a lot of things that I've been involved in over the past 25 years. So I'm just going to touch on them just to give you an idea of sort of what are jobs in different areas and sectors of work around food justice. So I started out when I stepped out of the kitchen as a chef working on school food and school nutrition programs, both doing local sourcing so that we were getting more locally grown food into schools, as well as working with our local school district to change our menus and find things that kids wanted to eat, but that were much less processed foods. Another avenue was doing community-led participatory food policy. So we led in 2010 to 2012 a large citywide effort to create a food policy for our city that involved going out into the community and gathering information and holding a few different summits at our city hall to really create a food policy for our city to address the issues across the food system that community members were concerned about. Urban agriculture, urban gardens, regenerative farming and training of farm workers. Sorry, there should be a comment in there, and workers' rights and composting as like a big category. So as mentioned, I'm on the board of Soulfire Farm since the nonprofit was founded in 2015. And we do training of Black, Brown, and Indigenous farmers, and a lot of other work around food justice in undoing racial inequities and economic inequities in the food system. And then a lot of work around supporting urban agriculture in the city of New Haven, Connecticut, and local efforts to do composting here. Another realm is looking at both indigenous to the United States as well as global indigenous food and land sovereignty work. So as I mentioned, the rights of rice, the rights of nature work, looking at traditional indigenous food practices such as nixtamalizing corn and growing heirloom corn, which you can see in the middle photo. And this is a group called, on the right, called the I Collective. There's many more chefs, but it's a group of indigenous chefs from across the United States and Latin America who are stewards of indigenous food sovereignty work and foodways. So some other work that I've supported is around supporting Black, Brown, and Indigenous and people of color owned food businesses who often don't have as much access to money and social networks to support them launching their food businesses, as well as working with immigrants and refugees who often have a lot of great cooking skills, and it is a way for them to create their own jobs when they come here. So there's a program called Sanctuary Kitchen that grew out of work that I did at an organization called CitySeed, and a number of groups that do mentoring for local Black, Brown, and Indigenous owned food businesses in New Haven. And then looking at food and farm worker rights. So La Via Campesina is a global movement of peasants and farm workers. And then there, of course, are many groups locally that are working on farm and food worker rights. And that is a very important part of this work as well. And I just quickly added this slide as we were signing on, but some of the work that I've been doing at Yale over the past couple of years is supporting work on, I have a position at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. And some of the projects that I'm currently, I started a regenerative agriculture lab. And so we are working with 3 partners right now. Grupo Trimex, which is a group in Mexico that is the largest wheat milling and wheat distribution company. We're working with them on a regenerative agriculture framework that is like a farm worker centered regenerative agriculture framework. The Black Farmer Fund grew out of some folks who are part of Soulfire Farm and then have created this fund, which started at $1 million and is on its way to being a $20 million fund that is funding Black farmers and food entrepreneurs using a community-led investing model as well as reparative practices. So really trying to undo systemic racial and economic inequities through the way that they are doing investing. If anyone's close to the New Haven area, Olivia Watkins, who is one of the founders, will be doing a talk on November 6th at lunch, and I can send you info about that. You're welcome to join, it's free. And then the third group we're working with is Chef Pierre Tamin, who founded the company Yolele, which is based in Senegal and Mali, and they are growing fonio, which is a grain that is indigenous to the Sahel, which is the region below the Sahel is the region below the Sierra across West Africa. And fonio is a climate resilient grain that is indigenous to that area. And that company is not only growing the grain and kind of using the global marketplace to create more money that is then reinvested in the communities of farmers in West Africa. So he's really building that business, trying to avoid the corporatization and extractiveness that some companies do. He says, I don't want to be the next quinoa. He really is trying to grow this business in a way that is economically benefiting local farmers right now, mostly across Mali and Senegal. And so we are working with him on that project. And then some other things are some student projects, other projects around investing, some projects around connecting ocean farming and land-based farming. That project will be released shortly. And then I also do work through the Northeast Forest Farmers Coalition, which is through a SARE grant. We have 2 SARE grants, so it's, I think, going to be a full 6 years of work, building out supports for Northeast forest farmers and training people on how to do forest farming in the Northeast. And then another element of this work is working through coalitions. This is a photo of Heal Food Alliance, which is primarily Black, Brown, and Indigenous alliance of folks who are really deeply committed to food justice work, and they have a number of different things they work on. I highlight them both because I think the work they do is really amazing and because of the importance of coalitions. So even if your work is through a business or through a government agency or through a nonprofit, and it's not necessarily focused on systemic change, or addressing some more maybe radical or leftist or political elements of changing the food system, participating in a coalition, becoming a partner in a coalition, can actually bring power to that coalition and allow your workplace to participate in broader systemic change, even if that is not the focus of the work you do. So, for example, they're working on over the past year or so, they have been pushing Farm Bill amendments that really center workers, center Black and Brown farmers and farm workers, and address issues of racial and economic equity in the Farm Bill. And so they sort of built a whole platform, and then they work with groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists as part of their group, and many other folks to try to advance that platform. So that coalition and others are groups that you could be part of to help work on broader systemic issues. They also work on things like the Good Food Purchasing program and other things. And then another thing that is really dear to my heart is story gathering. So I think a bit inspired by my grandparents, but also inspired by how much I love going out and talking with people in community about the work they do. As I stepped out of doing nonprofit, working for a nonprofit in 2016, I decided to start recording stories. And so I started a podcast, as was mentioned, called The Table Underground. And now I actually, over the past year, have been working as a producer for Connecticut Public Radio on a lot of similar stories. And so using journalism, using story gathering, narrative telling, whether it's through social media, radio, or other avenues, is a really powerful tool to use to promote the work you're doing and to promote change in the food system. So some systems of power that create inequities and injustices in the food system, it's important to look at what are these systems of power that are creating the injustices as we think about how do we actually address making systemic change. So looking at how has capitalism influenced the global food system, right? In really huge ways, where we have this concentration of wealth and resources in the North and a lot of taking of resources from the South. And of course, we have lots of inequities in the North as well. Looking at how has colonialism actually changed, for example, across the African continent, there are tons of farmers that are using very European farming practices and have actually, because of capitalism and colonialism, have actually been pushed to move away from their traditional farming practices, which often are more beneficial to the environment and don't involve them having to purchase fertilizer, for example, which right now there's a fertilizer shortage because of the war in Ukraine. If people had been practicing and supported in practicing their traditional farming practices and growing crops that are indigenous to those regions, it's environmentally more sustainable and allows people to also be eating diets that are traditionally beneficial as well. So looking at these different systems, patriarchy, racism, other things, and looking at the people involved in these systems, what are the policies and the practices that are being created that they actually maintain through these systems, and how do we actually understand those and then do work to undo them? And I just want to be clear, this is not to say that we're supposed to go back in time. This is to say, how do we look at the harm that's been done by these systems, look at traditional practices, and how do we actually move things into the modern era while respecting all of those understandings? So I'm going to just play this video, and then it's short, and then just would love to hear, after you watch this video, a few people share about what are the systems at play in understanding food apartheid. As this is Malik Yakini, who is an amazing decades-long food justice activist from Detroit.
I don't think, can other people hear the sound? I can't hear the sound on
Oh,
my
I was
end.
just going to ask that. Okay. I forget how to share the sound. Hold on. Does anybody know how to do this easily? What I'm supposed to do to share the sound from the video?
It might be in your settings on your microphone settings.
Mm-hmm.
If you go down to where it says mute, you might
Yep.
be able to switch your speaker over.
I wonder if I pull
I
my
think
head.
you might need to end this screen share and restart the share. Then when you want to restart, there's a small tick button that says share sound.
Let's see if I put.
Yeah, because when I try to share my screen, there's a small
This-
box that you see.
While I was growing up,
Yeah.
there were lots
Can
of
you
folks
hear
here in
this
the
now?
city who had moved to
Yep.
Detroit
Okay.
from the South, beginning of the 1920s,
Okay, thank
including
you.
my grandparents on both sides. There were grocery stores almost everywhere in the city. There was a national chain grocer within walking distance of every location inside the city of Detroit. That all changed by 2007 when Farmer Jack, the last of those national chain groceries, closed its doors and Detroit became labeled as a food desert. The USDA defines a food desert as a low-income census tract where a substantial number or share of residents has low access to supermarket or local grocery stores. There's multiple problems with the term food desert. One of the problems is that typically people think of a desert as a very barren landscape. And the reality is that a desert is actually a very vibrant ecosystem. Another problem with the definitions used of food deserts is that it presupposes that the answer to these areas that lack access to healthy food is more grocery stores. A third problem with the term food deserts is it's not a term that people living in those areas use to describe their own situation. It's similar to the term at-risk child used in schools. I was a school principal for several years and never heard a parent come to me and say, "This is my son, John. He's an at-risk child." This is a term which is imposed upon communities as opposed to a term that community members use to define their own condition. The fourth and perhaps most problematic issue with the term food desert is that it doesn't speak to the intentionality of the conditions that exist in communities that have low access to healthy foods. The reality is that public policy and economic practices have created these areas that have low access to foods, and food desert does not speak to that intentionality. Recently, the term food apartheid has resonated with myself and other food activists. Dara Cooper defines food apartheid as the systemic destruction of Black self-determination to control our food, including land, resource theft, and discrimination. A hypersaturation of destructive foods and predatory marketing, and a blatantly discriminatory corporate-controlled food system that results in our communities suffering from some of the highest rates of heart disease and diabetes of all times. Many tend to use the term food desert. However, food apartheid, according to Dar, is a much more accurate representation of the structural, racialized inequities perpetuated through our current food system. Whatever term we use to describe the situation, there are vast inequities in the American food system that are caused by historical, intentional, racist, and classist policies, resulting in far too many Black and brown and poor white people not having sufficient access to fresh, healthy, high nutrient dense, affordable food. I join with those who say that such access is a human right and that denying that right in one of the wealthiest nations in the world is unconscionable.
So I'd love to hear from anybody if you'd like to just chime in about that video. What are systems at play that are creating food apartheid in our society? You can just go off mute and speak because I can't see your hands.
Okay, so
Um,
one key takeaway that I got from the video is the concept of how land, especially agricultural land, can be managed, how ownership of land is distributed and access to land, because most food and food growing activities obviously happen on those lands. So I think that's like one area where equity and access plays a role in determining
Mhm.
security of food.
Yes, thank you. Anybody else?
I was actually going to say the same thing. Access to land, and also the fact that it's really difficult to be a farmer in this country without generational wealth or access to land and inheriting a farm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. What are some of the things that might have affected where stores are or who has money to access food?
Racial discrimination.
Mhm.
Mm.
Absolutely.
I would think that there has been economic policies that led to the overall degradation of that community, that led to these supermarkets suffering a lack of demand, or whatever reason that they did not find that community profitable anymore, and hence they moved away.
Yeah, and the racial discrimination piece connects both because people are discriminated against in terms of being able to get jobs, in terms of applying to schools. And so you have many generations of that discrimination then creating poverty in communities. You have redlining in this country, which prevented Black and brown people, and at one point Jewish people, from being able to buy homes, which then prevented them from having generational wealth and prevented, there was clear rules about not allowing certain businesses to open in Black and brown neighborhoods. So over many decades, as you saw in that picture, you went from a community that was very vibrant with having lots of stores to real estate law, hiring practices, racial discrimination in so many different ways in the society, all contributing to creating neighborhoods where there was not access to food in many different ways, as well as people having less and less generational, less and less wealth to be able to access food and access to transportation, et cetera. So that's a big conversation. I'm going to just try to wrap up with a couple quick things, which is that while I've been talking about systemic change and that it is really important that we address root causes and look at systemic change in whatever field we're working in, there also are these different spheres for work that are all very important. So there's personal and interpersonal change, right? Like things that can happen on a personal level. There's work that can happen at a communal level. And then there's also this kind of systemic change. And all of those are really important areas to work in. Sometimes we're able to work across all of them, and sometimes we need to focus on one or two of them. And so I just want to name those as like different ways that change and different spheres that change can happen in and work can happen in. So another element of change making is that there's a lot of different skill sets that are involved and in making change and having justice work. So this diagram is based on a diagram that is used at Soulfire Farm and part of their Undoing Racism in the Food System trainings. And it was featured in Yes Magazine maybe last year or the year before. So a butterfly has 4 wings. It needs all 4 wings to fly. And in this model, we're looking at, in terms of change making and social justice, that there are one wing is representing people who are doing resistance work, so protesting, boycotting, organizing, and strategizing around resistance to issues in our society. Reformers is another wing, another type of work, people who try to make change from within. So you could be working within the USDA, within a school system, within a business, within an organization, making change from within. And then builders, people who are actively building alternatives to our current institutions and systems. And then people doing healing work. So this could be explicit healing work, like a therapist or religious healing. It could be mediation, artwork that creates healing and connection, storytelling, etc. And so one thing, it can be very overwhelming when you're looking at the issues in the world, like, oh my goodness, how do we tackle all of the issues of the world? But what's important is actually understanding that we need to work within an ecosystem, and we don't have to try to do everything. We just need to build relationships with people and organizations and businesses and movement workers who are doing different elements of this work, because we need all these different kinds of work and more in order to make change. So sometimes people who are doing resistant work can push the narrative. If you look at like Black Lives Matter, for example, push the narrative and got people thinking about systemic racism, right? That was not a mainstream thing a few years ago for people to even talk about systemic racism and talk as much about racial equity work. So people doing resistance work sort of pushed the narrative. Then reformers are working within an organization or agency or business to actually help make that work happen from within that organization. And then again, builders building new things that didn't exist before, and healers doing healing work to actually help that work move forward. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. And it's great to remember that we don't have to do all of them. We just need to be in relationship with people doing different types of work. And this is another diagram that's sort of touching on something similar. And when I'm working with grad students, and they're often coming and saying, like, I want to work in addressing food waste, or I want to work in agroforestry and different things, I often ask them, like, what do you love to do? What do you feel passionate about? What type of work makes you come alive? And think about that, and then figure out how can you plug that in to this web of social change work, this web of work in this sector, because there are many different ways to work on all of the issues that you all are interested in, to work on food justice and any of the broader issues that you're interested in. But allowing yourself to ask that question, you know, it's a privilege to ask that question, but allow yourself to ask it and see, is it possible to do this work in a way that is the work that makes me really excited? Because of course, if you're able to do that, it really brings passion and joy and often effectiveness into that work. And to remember that there's many different ways, right? There's many different places to do the work, and there's many different ways to go about doing this work. So that is what I will